The storm came faster than Kael'thar's instruments predicted, which was itself a failure she would need to document carefully, because Koreth surveyors were supposed to read Harren's world better than imported technology could. She'd been working the Eastern Survey line, mapping mineral composition in a section of the flats that colonial administration wanted assessed before expanding extraction operations. Standard work. Work she'd done dozens of times across 7 years of field work on Harren's world. The electromagnetic storms that periodically swept the Koreth flats were well documented and supposedly predictable within acceptable margins. Supposedly. When she checked her instruments and found the storm's leading edge already visible on the horizon, closer than it should have been, moving faster than the morning's projections had suggested, she made the immediate calculations that Koreth surveyors were trained to make in exactly these situations. Distance to main settlement, too far. Distance to nearest emergency shelter, barely achievable if she moved immediately and didn't stop for anything. She moved. The Koreth flats were named for her people, but the colonial settlers had made the flats economically significant in ways that brought humans and other species into territory that had previously been exclusively Koreth domain. The emergency shelter network was a collaborative project. Koreth traditional knowledge about storm patterns combined with colonial engineering capacity to produce structures that could keep anyone alive until weather cleared. Kael'thar had used 2 different shelters during her survey work. Both times had been exactly as expected: cramped, functional, solitary waiting until the storm passed. She could see the shelter ahead when the storm's leading edge reached her, the particular electric silence that her people called the swallowing. When charged atmospheric conditions absorbed ambient sound and turned the familiar flats into something disorienting and dangerous. Wind hit her hard enough to require physical resistance. In the distance, she could hear the crack and sizzle of electrical discharge against the flat ground. The storm's advanced scouts, testing what was conductive, finding the path of least resistance. She was conductive. The survey equipment she carried was extremely conductive. Kael'thar covered the last 50 meters to the shelter at something between a run and controlled stumbling, reaching the reinforced door as the first full discharge hit the ground 40 meters to her left. She wrenched the handle. The door opened. She stepped forward into warmth and dim light and stopped. The human looked up from the equipment he'd been working on, assessed the situation in seconds, and began moving things aside to make space. Practical, automatic, the immediate instinct to accommodate a second person before anything else. She knew that instinct, had watched it operate for 4 years. His name was Daniel Reeves. Kael'thar stood in the doorway with the storm howling at her back and 3 years of distance collapsing in the span of a single recognition. Daniel Reeves, xenogeologist, human. 3 years older than the last time she'd seen him, but recognizably himself in every way that mattered. The careful economy of his movements when he was trying not to startle someone. The instinct toward practical accommodation over emotional response. The way genuine warmth existed in his expression, without being pushed forward as expectation or demand. The shelter was small, 3 meters by 4 meters roughly, emergency supplies along one wall, a single bench along another, a work surface where Daniel had clearly been organizing equipment before her arrival had interrupted whatever he was doing. He was making space, moving things with the same methodical efficiency she remembered from field work, from the 4 years of joint survey and analysis work that had produced some of the most cited geological and mineral research from this region of Harren's world. "You should come in," he said. His voice was the same, the particular quality of it direct, informational, no unnecessary additions. The leading edge of these storms can discharge on anything conductive standing in the open. He didn't say, "I'm surprised to see you." He didn't say, "Of all the shelters in all the flats." He didn't make it complex, didn't load the practical statement with the weight of everything that existed between them. just stated a fact about electrical discharge and left her to do what survival required. She recognized that choice as a choice. He was giving her the shelter without making her negotiate for it. Kael'thar stepped inside, pulled the door shut behind her. The sound of the storm went from immediate threat to muffled presence, still audible, still powerful, but reduced to something the walls could hold at arm's length. She turned to face the space she would share with Daniel Reeves for however long the storm lasted. He'd made room on the bench, had arranged his equipment so it took up less than half the available space, was looking at her with an expression she remembered, patient attention, waiting for information, not performing the careful diplomatic neutrality that people sometimes used when they were angry but didn't want to show it. Just waiting. The same way he'd always waited when there was something to understand and understanding would take time. "How long?" she asked, nodding toward his instrument readings rather than acknowledging any of the other questions the situation contained. He checked, based on current readings, at least 6 hours, possibly 8. Kael'thar looked at the shelter dimensions, at the space Daniel had cleared on the bench, at the emergency supplies along the wall that would sustain 2 people through several days if needed. 6 to 8 hours, approximately 3 meters of floor space, significant unresolved history. "Thank you," she said, "for making space." "Of course," Daniel said. He said it simply, without making it mean more than it meant. She sat down on the cleared section of bench and pulled out her own instruments to check the storm readings independently. They were both professional enough to start with the practical. For the first hour, they communicated about logistics. Storm duration estimates from both instrument sets, which confirmed the 6 to 8 hour projection. Water supplies, both had standard field rations. Emergency heating status, functional. Communication systems, both attempting to register their shelter positions with Colonial Emergency Management, both receiving confirmation that their locations were logged. Professional, functional. The kind of communication that 2 competent field workers conducted when they happened to share shelter space, regardless of any prior relationship or lack thereof. Kael'thar had spent 7 years developing the capacity to maintain professional focus under difficult conditions. The storm outside had tried to kill her 20 minutes ago, and she'd spent most of those 20 minutes running for her life. She could manage appropriate professional composure in a small shelter. What she couldn't entirely manage was the absence of awareness. The fact that 3 meters of floor space made it impossible to not notice Daniel's presence, the small sounds of his movements, the particular way he organized his equipment into neat functional arrangements. She had 4 years of detailed familiarity with how Daniel Reeves operated in field conditions. That knowledge didn't disappear because she'd spent 3 years trying to create distance from it. The second hour passed in something that was technically silence, but functioned as mutual acknowledgement that both of them were aware the silence was about something. During the third hour, Daniel spoke. "I've thought about whether to ask you this if I ever had the chance," he said. "For 3 years, I decided that if the opportunity presented itself, I would rather know than maintain a comfortable fiction that I had sufficient explanation already." Kael'thar looked at him directly. The shelter's dim light made his expression readable in the particular way that low-contrast conditions sometimes clarified rather than obscured. Nothing to distract from the basic information a face was transmitting. He was asking because he wanted to understand. Not because he was angry, not because he needed something from her, not because the question was a vehicle for accusation. Just because Daniel Reeves had always found incomplete understanding more uncomfortable than difficult truth. "What do you want to ask?" she said. "Why you left the partnership without explanation," Daniel said. "Not the version you gave the research committee. Equipment methodology differences and different priorities for the next research phase. That explanation was accurate enough to function. I want to know whether there was a different reason that you didn't include." The storm pressed at the shelter walls with a sound like sustained argument. "There was," Kael'thar said, She'd been carrying the incomplete honesty for 3 years. The weight of having given him a true answer that wasn't the complete answer, of having allowed accuracy to substitute for transparency. In the small enclosed space of an emergency shelter during a storm that had pushed her through a door without giving her time to prepare for what she'd find inside, she recognized that she was done carrying it. "Tell me what it was," Daniel said. Not a demand, an invitation. So she did. Kael'thar chose her words with the precision that her best professional work required, the recognition that accuracy mattered more than comfort when the truth carried consequence. "The work was excellent," she said. "I need you to understand that first, because everything I say after it is easier to misinterpret without that foundation. The 4 years of research we produced together was the best work of my career. The methodology was sound. The partnership functioned well by every professional measure I know how to apply." Daniel was quiet, listening, not rushing toward conclusion. "But I was losing methodological clarity," Kael'thar continued. "Not about the research itself. The survey data was clean, the analysis was rigorous. About what the partnership was. About the difference between work that matters deeply to me and a person who matters deeply to me, and how those two things need to remain distinct for survey work to maintain integrity." She watched him absorb this without interrupting. "Koreth surveyors have specific cultural frameworks around research partnerships," she said. "They exist because our relationship with Harren's world depends on accurate observation, and accurate observation requires that surveyors not be influenced by anything other than what the data actually shows. The frameworks are designed to prevent exactly the kind of confusion I was experiencing. I was making research decisions that were partly motivated by what would extend the partnership, rather than entirely by what the survey data indicated. Not dramatically, nothing that compromised the published findings at the level that would require correction, but at the margins, in small choices about direction and emphasis and which findings to pursue further. I noticed it," she said. "I recognized what was happening, and I understood that the right response, professionally and ethically, was to create the separation that would restore clarity." The storm outside seemed to intensify for a moment, the electrical discharge more frequent, the sound of it pressing harder against the shelter's reinforced walls. "You could have told me," Daniel said. His voice carried no accusation, but the simple statement contained the thing she'd been carrying. "Yes," Kael'thar said. "That's the part I've been carrying for 3 years. Not that I left. I believe leaving was correct. I needed the separation to restore perspective, and 3 years of working alone has confirmed that the clarity is back in ways it wasn't then. What I regret is that I gave you the methodology explanation and let you believe that was the complete answer. It was true. It wasn't honest. There's a distinction between those things that I believe matters." She met his eyes directly in the shelter's dim light. "I was afraid," she said. "If I explained it honestly, you would try to solve it. You would suggest restructuring the partnership or establishing clearer professional frameworks or finding some practical approach to address the problem, because that is genuinely how you think. And I didn't want a solution at that point. I needed distance, and I was afraid that your instinct toward practical problem-solving would make distance harder to create. So I gave you an answer that was true enough to be honest in the narrow sense," she continued, "but incomplete in ways that meant you couldn't fully understand what happened. That was not how I should have handled it. The person I believe I am, the surveyor I believe I am, doesn't manage difficult conversations by giving accurate but incomplete answers to avoid having to navigate someone else's response to the complete truth." The storm continued its sustained argument with the shelter. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after she finished. The quality of his silence was one she recognized, not processing hurt or formulating response, but settling into understanding. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally. "The leaving was genuinely hard to understand for a long time. The official explanation had enough surface plausibility that I could accept it functionally, but it never quite fit with how the partnership had been operating. This fits. He paused. For what it's worth, I recognize you may not want anything from me about this. I would have preferred the honest conversation. At the time, not because I would necessarily have been able to solve it or because I wouldn't have tried, but because understanding what's actually happening is something I value more than having comfortable interpretations of things. Even when the accurate understanding is harder, Kael'thar said. Especially then, Daniel confirmed. Comfortable inaccuracy accumulates in ways that create larger problems later. I'd rather understand things as they are. She recognized this about him, had always recognized it. It was part of what had made the confusion difficult to manage. When someone's core characteristic is rigorous honesty and accurate understanding, the line between admiring that quality professionally and valuing the person who embodied it personally could become difficult to locate. That quality, she said, the one you just described, that is precisely what made the distinction difficult to maintain. It is easier to maintain professional clarity about a colleague who has characteristics you respect in the abstract. Less easy when the characteristics are ones you find genuinely admirable in the specific person. Noted, Daniel said. There was something almost careful about how he said it, acknowledgement without addition, receiving information without turning it into more than she'd offered. They sat with that for a while. They spent the remaining 4 hours talking about their separate work since the partnership ended, the survey directions she'd pursued alone, the geological analysis he'd continued in different sections of the flats, the findings each had produced that neither had been present for, about the research that still cited each other's contributions, the joint papers that continued to be referenced, the methodology they developed together that other researchers had adopted, the work that had outlasted the partnership that produced it, about what both of them had learned working alone that might have been impossible to learn working together, the particular clarity that solitude produced, the things that were harder without collaboration and the things that were easier. Not reconciliation exactly, not restoration of the partnership or negotiation about the future, just the honest accounting of what had happened and what had followed it, the kind of conversation that could only occur once the incomplete explanation had been replaced by the complete one. When Kael'thar's instruments showed the storm finally clearing, they began the preparation to leave, packing equipment, checking conditions, restoring the shelter supplies to their standard emergency configuration. At the door, Kael'thar paused. I came into this shelter because the storm was going to kill me, she said. I didn't choose to be here, and I wasn't prepared for who I found inside. I know, Daniel said. I was already here when the storm developed faster than the projections. Neither of us planned this. But I'm not sorry it happened, she said. I've been carrying the weight of that incomplete answer for 3 years. I don't think I would have looked for the opportunity to correct it. I would have continued avoiding the discomfort of that conversation indefinitely. The storm forced it. Sometimes forced proximity does that, Daniel said. Sometimes, Kael'thar agreed. More often it just forces proximity and the people endure it until they can separate again. I could have spent those 6 hours maintaining careful professional distance. You could have accepted that and not asked. I considered not asking, Daniel said. It seemed like the option that would be easier for both of us. But I decided that easier wasn't what I actually wanted from those hours if there was a chance of understanding instead. The door opened onto flats that the storm had swept into temporary clarity, the particular clean quality of a landscape after high electromagnetic activity, when the charged particles had grounded and the air held a different kind of stillness. They stood at the threshold for a moment, looking out at the clear distance. The Eastern Survey line, Kael'thar said. I'll need to return to it once conditions are stable. I lost several hours of work when the storm developed. The Northern Extraction Assessment, Daniel said. Same situation. We came in from different directions. Different directions, she said. Different parts of the flats. Yes, he said simply. They walked out onto the cleared ground and moved in the directions their separate work required. Not together. The partnership had ended, and 3 years of separate work had established separate directions that weren't the same as the ones they'd pursued together. But behind them, in a small shelter they'd both reached by different routes and found in a storm neither had predicted, there was an honesty that hadn't existed before. Not resolution, exactly. Just truth where there had been incomplete truth. Sometimes that